Welcome back. We are going to cover section 1.1. We are still in chapter 1, but we're now looking at section 1.7, conditional relations. And conditional relations deal with the language of necessary and sufficient conditions. And you can find this on page 21 of your textbook. And here's what it has to say. Conditional statements are used to state necessary and sufficient conditions between properties, states of affairs, events, and any other conditions that can be described by statements. What this is saying is that conditionals demonstrate for us the necessary and the sufficient conditions. So in a standard form conditional, if P then Q, which is necessary and which is sufficient? Well, a sufficient condition makes it so. That's the way you can think about it. It makes it so. Whereas a necessary condition is just something that's required. So let's take an example. This is our example of Harry. And Harry is a very bad man. Harry is so bad that he has to be killed. What we need is a sufficient condition that makes it so. Let's take a look at less to see if we can figure out how this relates to conditionals. Less number 3 tells us a sufficient condition for Q is P. Or another way of saying that, P is a sufficient condition for Q. So again, what we're trying to say here is that in a standard form conditional, if P then Q, P is sufficient. P is sufficient. So what we're looking for is what is a sufficient condition for killing Harry? So what is it that we do? What is it that would be sufficient? What would make it so that we have killed Harry? Remember, a sufficient condition makes it so. A necessary condition is just something that's required. And we want to know what is sufficient for killing Harry. Now, is stabbing Harry sufficient for killing him? No, we could stab him in his little finger, but we wouldn't have killed him. How about shooting at Harry? Is that sufficient for killing him? Well, no, because we might miss. All right, well, what about shooting Harry? Well, lots of people survive gunshot wounds. So none of these are sufficient. We need something that makes it so. So does anybody know what would make it the case that we have killed Harry? I'm going to go with chopping off his head. So we can say if we chop off Harry's head, then we've killed Harry. If we chop off Harry's head, then we have killed Harry. And what we want to check for, are there any instances where it's true that we chopped off his head and it's false that we've killed him? No? Then we have found our sufficient condition. Now, we want to look for what is necessary. What is necessary? And if we have killed Harry, then we have done what? What is the necessary condition for that? If we've killed Harry, then we have shot him? No, it's not necessary to shoot somebody in order to kill them. But what is necessary? Well, the necessary condition is what is required. And Les has to tell us, number 4, a necessary condition for P is Q. Another way of saying that, Q is the necessary condition. So in the standard form, if P then Q, Q is necessary. And what is a necessary condition for killing Harry? Well, some things that are necessary is his heart must stop, his lungs must stop, and his circulation must stop, as well as brain function. All of these things are necessary. So if we have killed Harry, then we've stopped his heart. Any instances where we've killed him and we haven't stopped his heart? Well, it might beat for a few more beats, but eventually it stops. It has to stop, or we wouldn't have killed him. Again, we've stopped his lungs. Yes. We've stopped his circulation, and we've stopped his brain function. So we have provided both sufficient conditions for killing Harry. We chopped off his head, and then we provided the necessary conditions. And now we're going to say goodbye to Harry and move on. So in this standard conditional, if it is a mammal, then it is warm-blooded. What's the sufficient condition? Remember, Les told us P is the sufficient condition. And so here, our P, or antecedent, it is a mammal. And this means that being a mammal makes it so that it is warm-blooded. Or another way of saying this, being a mammal is sufficient for it being warm-blooded. Now, let's take a look at the necessary condition. Here, same standard conditional. Now we want to know what the necessary condition is. And Les tells us that Q is the necessary. And our Q is it is warm-blooded. So what is required or necessary for being a mammal? Being warm-blooded. So, if it is a mammal, then it is warm-blooded. The antecedent P is sufficient, and the consequent is necessary. So let's look at some counterexamples. Is being warm-blooded sufficient to make it a mammal? Let me ask this again. Is being warm-blooded make it so that you're a mammal? Well, I'm giving you a visual cue here, so I'm hoping you're jumping on this. Birds are warm-blooded, and they are not mammals. So, warm-blooded is not sufficient. And what we want you to be able to do is to tell the difference between necessary conditions and sufficient conditions and be able to provide them. And what we've demonstrated is if P then Q means P is a sufficient condition for Q. It also means that Q is a necessary condition for P. So let's take a look at this. If it is a brown dog, then it is brown. Remember, P, it is a brown dog, is the antecedent. Q, it is brown, is the consequent. The antecedent is sufficient. So what is the sufficient condition in the above conditional? Being a brown dog is sufficient for being brown. Anybody know what is necessary for being a brown dog? If you don't, send me a note and we'll talk about it. In this section, the skills they want you to be able to master is recognize logically equivalent conditional statements. And that means all of those hidden conditionals on less. You have to recognize them, be able to translate them, put them into standard form. However, they also want you to understand how they work. Which part is necessary and which part is sufficient, and how is that demonstrated? And we're still working on learning to translate hidden conditionals into standard form, really important skill. And then in 1.7, you're going to come up against this challenge of how difficult it is to stipulate necessary and sufficient conditions. It's pretty challenging, but just keep at it. And think about Harry. Stabbing him, right? That's not sufficient. Shooting him, it isn't sufficient. So really work this through. In the homework, it asks us to name a necessary condition for each of the following events. So, it's going to look something like this. Remember, the necessary is the consequent, so it's going to give you an antecedent and ask you to fill in the necessary condition of the consequent. So, if I've eaten trout, then I've swallowed trout. This will work, and we can check it against the truth diagram. Are there any instances where I've eaten trout but I haven't swallowed trout? No. So this is necessary. If I've eaten trout, then I have put trout in my mouth. Any instances where you ate it, but you didn't put it in your mouth? No. This is a necessary part of eating trout. If I have eaten trout, then I have chewed the trout. Any instances where I've eaten the trout, but I didn't chew it? Yes, it could be so thin and buttery flaky that it just melts in your mouth and you swallow. So this is not necessary. If I've eaten trout, then I have eaten fish. No instances where you eat trout, but you don't eat fish. So this is another necessary condition. And that's how the homework is going to work. For A, it asks for necessary conditions. So a necessary condition for being in California. If I am in California, then you have to fill it in. Then B asks for a sufficient condition. And remember, sufficient condition is the Q. I'm sorry, is the P. Please excuse me. If sufficient condition, then I'm in California. What is a sufficient condition for being in California? Now C is going to ask you for both. Both. So if what? Then I'm in California. That's going to be your sufficient cause. And then if I'm in California, then what? That's going to be your necessary clause. So C is going to ask for both the sufficient clause and the necessary clause. Good luck. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have questions on this. Feel free to post in discussions and get some talk going because it's getting harder. So stick with it and we will get through this. Best of luck.